July 11th, 1940. A single document lands on the desks of 135 American automobile manufacturers. The United States Army wants a vehicle that does not yet exist, built to specifications that seem impossible, delivered on a timeline that borders on absurd. 49 days to deliver a working prototype. 75 days to deliver 70 test vehicles. The vehicle must weigh no more than 1,300 pounds, produce at least 40 horsepower, climb a 45-degree slope, and carry 660 pounds of cargo through terrain that would destroy a conventional car. Of the 135 companies contacted, only 2 will submit serious proposals. One is a tiny firm in Butler, Pennsylvania, on the edge of bankruptcy. The other is a struggling Toledo manufacturer with a single engineer who refuses to accept failure. Neither company knows that what they are about to create will become the most mass-produced military vehicle in history, a machine that would later be called America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. This is the story of the Willys Jeep, the quarter-ton vehicle that carried an army to victory. In the summer of 1940, the United States Army faced a mobility crisis that most Americans did not understand. The fall of France in June had shocked military planners in Washington. German panzer divisions had swept across Europe with a speed and coordination that made American equipment look obsolete. The infantry branch needed a replacement for aging motorcycles, sidecars, and repurposed Ford Model Ts that had served since the previous war. What they envisioned was a light reconnaissance vehicle, something small enough to avoid detection, powerful enough to cross rough terrain, and simple enough that any soldier could repair it in the field. The specifications drafted by the Quartermaster Corps reflected this urgency. The vehicle required 4-wheel drive with a 2-speed transfer case. It needed a fold-down windshield for a low battlefield silhouette. Approach angles of 45 degrees and departure angles of 40 degrees would allow it to climb and descend steep terrain without scraping. A rectangular body with 3 bucket seats would carry a driver, a commander, and a gunner. The entire package had to fit within an 80-inch wheelbase and weigh no more than 1,300 pounds, a figure that engineers would later acknowledge was essentially impossible. The deadline was staggering. Companies had 11 days to submit bids. The winning bidder would have 49 days to deliver a running prototype and 75 days to deliver 70 test vehicles. From request to full delivery, the Army allowed just 130 days. Most major manufacturers looked at the specifications, looked at the timeline, and declined to participate. General Motors passed. Chrysler passed. Studebaker passed. The engineering challenge was formidable, but the real problem was economic. No company could justify the investment required to meet such demanding specifications for what might amount to a small government contract. Only American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania submitted a complete proposal by the July 22 deadline. Bantam was the smallest automobile manufacturer in the United States, a company that had sold fewer than 2,000 cars the previous year and was operating on the edge of bankruptcy. Their entire engineering staff consisted of a handful of employees working in a cramped plant that had seen better days. But Bantam had one critical advantage. They had nothing to lose. Willys Overland Motors of Toledo, Ohio, submitted a rough sketch and an honest admission that they could not meet the 49-day prototype deadline. They requested 120 days instead. Ford Motor Company expressed reservations, but was pressured to participate by the Quartermaster Corps, which valued Ford's massive production capacity. If this vehicle worked, the Army would need tens of thousands of them. The man who would design the blueprint that launched the Jeep arrived at Bantam's Butler plant on July 17, 1940, just 5 days before the bid deadline. Karl Probst was a freelance automotive engineer from Detroit, 57 years old, with decades of experience at companies like Chalmers and REO. Bantam's president, Frank Fenn, had recruited Probst specifically for this project, but Probst was initially reluctant. Bantam was broke and offered no upfront payment. The timeline seemed ridiculous. The specifications appeared unachievable. What changed Probst's mind was a phone call from William Knudsen, Commissioner of Industrial Production on the National Defense Advisory Commission and former president of General Motors. Knudsen understood the stakes better than most. He told Probst directly that this project was important to the country. "Forget your office," Knudsen said. "If you bring this off, and I know you can, we will see that you get some money." By most accounts, Probst received just $200 for his work. It would prove to be one of the greatest bargains in automotive history. Arriving at Butler, Probst found that Bantam's chief engineer, Harold Christ, along with Chester Hempfling and Ralph Turner, had already prepared preliminary designs and a mock-up. Probst worked through the weekend without sleep, finalizing the core design by Friday, July 19th, and completing blueprints, cost calculations, and supplier specifications by Saturday. The drawings that emerged from those 5 days would define the basic architecture of every Jeep built during World War II. The Bantam pilot car, nicknamed the Blitz Buggy and later known as Old Number 1, was completed and running by September 21, 1940. Harold Christ drove the prototype from Butler to Camp Holabird, Maryland, where it arrived on September 23rd, meeting the 49-day deadline with hours to spare. The Quartermaster Corps accepted the bid in approximately 30 minutes. The little vehicle from the little company had accomplished what the automotive giants had declared impossible. Willys Overland delivered its prototype, designated the Quad. On November 13, 1940, Ford delivered its entry, called the Pygmy, on November 23rd. All three vehicles underwent grueling testing at Camp Holabird over the following weeks. The results revealed clear differences among the three contenders. Bantam's vehicle weighed roughly 20-50 pounds and won on fuel economy and braking. Ford's Pygmy came in at about 2150 pounds and earned praise for driver comfort, but its modified Fordson tractor engine was criticized as underpowered and unreliable. The Willys Quad weighed a problematic 2450 pounds, nearly 300 pounds over the weight limit, but its engine was in a class by itself. The Go Devil engine, Willys inline 4L134, produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and 105 pound-feet of torque at just 2,000 RPM. Bantam's engine produced 40 horsepower. Ford's produced approximately 45. The Willys engine generated nearly 3 times the pulling power of its competitors at low speeds, exactly where an off-road military vehicle needed it most. This engine was the work of Delmar Roos, known as Barney, Willys Overland's executive vice president and chief engineer. Roos was a Cornell-educated engineer who had previously served as chief engineer at Studebaker for 11 years. He had modernized the old Willys Whippet 4 engine with insert bearings, a counterweighted crankshaft, lightweight aluminum pistons, full-pressure lubrication, and revised cam profiles. The result pushed output from roughly 48 horsepower to over 60 while maintaining exceptional reliability. But the competition that would determine the future of military mobility was marred by a decision that remains controversial to this day. The Army Quartermaster Corps shared copies of Bantam's blueprints with both Ford and Willys Overland, claiming that designs submitted under government contract became government property. Representatives from both larger companies were given ample opportunity to study the Bantam prototype's performance at Camp Holabird. Bantam protested vehemently, but was overruled. The Quartermaster General, taking a dim view of Bantam's limited production capacity, preferred suppliers who could manufacture vehicles by the tens of thousands. A compromise brokered on November 14, 1940, with help from the National Defense Advisory Commission, resulted in orders for 1,500 units from each company. The Federal Trade Commission opened its case in 1943 and issued its ruling on April 27, 1948. That the idea of creating a Jeep was originated by the American Bantam Company of Butler, Pennsylvania. In 2015, the Pennsylvania General Assembly unanimously adopted a resolution commemorating the 75th anniversary and formally recognizing Bantam as the inventor of the Jeep. Before Willys could win the standardized production contract, Barney Roos had to solve the weight problem. The Quad's 2450 pounds exceeded the 2160 pound limit by 290 pounds. Under Secretary of War, Patterson granted a temporary exemption, but future contracts required compliance. What followed became legendary in engineering circles. Roos undertook a systematic weight reduction campaign unlike anything attempted before. He disassembled the entire vehicle and weighed every single component, every bolt, bracket, and fastener. Studs, screws, and cotter pins were shortened. Clamp and washer sizes were reduced. The heavy carbon steel frame was replaced with lighter alloy. Body panels used thinner gauge steel. Even the paint was weighed. Only one coat could be applied because a second coat would breach the weight limit. The result was the Willys MA, which met the 21 60-pound limit with just 7 ounces to spare. 7 ounces. The margin between success and failure in one of history's most important military vehicles came down to the weight of a small cup of coffee. The testing that followed pushed all 3 prototypes beyond their design limits. At Camp Holabird, Army evaluators subjected the vehicles to punishment that would have destroyed civilian automobiles. They drove them through axle-deep mud for hours without rest. They climbed grades so steep that drivers had to stand on the pedals to maintain control. They forded streams that came up to the door panels. They loaded cargo until the springs flattened, then loaded more. The Willys quad consistently outperformed its rivals in the most demanding trials. Where the Bantam struggled on the steepest grades, the quad's superior torque pulled it through without hesitation. Where the Ford's engine overheated during extended low-speed operations, the Willys kept running. Army testers noted that the Go Devil engine seemed almost overbuilt for the application, delivering power reserves that other designs lacked. The evaluators also discovered unexpected capabilities. The Jeep could be pushed by 2 soldiers when stuck, something impossible with heavier vehicles. It could be manhandled out of shell craters. Its turning radius was tight enough to navigate between trees in dense forest. These characteristics, not part of the original specifications, would prove critical in combat conditions. By July 1941, the War Department decided to standardize on a single design for its next order of 16,000 vehicles. Willys won the contract, dated July 15, 1941, at a unit cost of $738.74. The winning design, designated MB, incorporated the best features of all 3 competitors. Most notably, it adopted Ford's flat, wide hood design, with headlights moved inward behind a straight grille. When Willys Overland could not keep up with wartime demand by late 1941, Ford received contracts to build Jeeps to Willys blueprints, including the Go Devil engine, under the designation GPW. The G stood for government, the P for 80-inch wheelbase, and the W for Willys licensed design. Ford retooled its plants at a cost of $4 million, roughly $60 million in today's currency, and produced its first GPW on January 2, 1942. The manufacturing challenge was immense. Ford had to produce a competitor's design exactly to specification, including an engine developed by Willys engineers. Every component had to be interchangeable between Willys MB and Ford GPW models. A part from a Toledo-built Jeep had to fit perfectly into a Dearborn-built Jeep, and vice versa. This level of standardization was unprecedented in automotive manufacturing. Ford engineers made subtle modifications to ease production using their existing tooling, but the vehicles remained functionally identical. The only reliable way to distinguish between the 2 manufacturers was the script F marking Ford stamped on certain components. Everything else, from the engine to the transmission to the body panels, had to meet the exact same tolerances. The supply chain grew to encompass hundreds of contractors across the country. Willys could not manufacture every component in Toledo. Neither could Ford in Dearborn. Springs came from one supplier, axles from another, electrical components from a third. Coordinating this network while maintaining quality standards required management systems that would later influence post-war manufacturing practices across American industry. The Willys MB that rolled off production lines represented a study in purposeful simplicity. The L134 Go Devil engine displaced 134 cubic inches from an undersquare inline 4 with a bore of 3.125 inches and a stroke of 4.375 inches. The engine was optimized for low RPM torque rather than peak horsepower. A single-barrel Carter WO carburetor fed the flathead design through side valves, and the compression ratio stood at 6.48 to 1. Power reached the wheels through a Borg-Warner T84 3-speed manual transmission mated to a Dana Spicer Model 18-2 speed transfer case. Twin shift levers controlled the system. The right lever selected high or low range. The left engaged or disengaged the front axle for 4-wheel drive. The combination yielded 6 forward gear ratios and 2 reverse. The 4-wheel drive system was part-time, meaning rear-wheel drive for normal road operation, with the front axle engaged manually when conditions demanded. The vehicle measured 80 inches in wheelbase, 132 inches overall length, 62 inches wide, and just 52 inches tall with the windshield folded and top down. This low profile was essential on the battlefield. Ground clearance reached 8.75 inches, with approach angles of 45 degrees and departure angles of 35 degrees. The 15-gallon fuel tank sat beneath the driver's seat, providing a highway range of roughly 300 miles at 22 to 24 miles per gallon. Top speed reached 65 miles per hour on paved roads. One deliberate design detail reflected the thinking of engineers who understood combat conditions. The tires used non-directional tread patterns, so the enemy could not determine direction of travel from tracks in mud or sand. Headlamps hinged upward to illuminate the engine compartment for nighttime field repairs. The entire electrical system ran on just 6 volts. The vehicle's payload was rated at 800 pounds cross-country, with a maximum towing capacity of 2,000 pounds. At the time of production, no four-wheel drive vehicle had ever been mass-produced in such numbers. The Willys MB became the world's first 4x4 manufactured in 6-figure quantities, a distinction that would reshape both military logistics and the civilian automobile industry for generations. The Jeep's closest Axis counterpart was the Volkswagen Type 82 Kübelwagen, a name meaning bucket car, designed by Ferdinand Porsche and derived from the Volkswagen Beetle platform. The comparison reveals why American industrial and engineering capacity proved so decisive in the war. The Kübelwagen's rear-mounted air-cooled flat 4-engine produced just 23 to 25 horsepower and drove only the rear wheels. It weighed a mere 1,600 pounds, over 850 pounds lighter than the Jeep, and achieved roughly 31 miles per gallon. But it produced less than a third of the Jeep's torque and lacked four-wheel drive entirely. The German vehicle had real advantages. Its air-cooled engine eliminated radiator vulnerability and freeze risk in extreme cold. Its flat underbody acted like a sled on sand and snow, partially compensating for the absence of four-wheel drive. Portal gear hub reductions at the wheels gave it roughly 11 inches of ground clearance, better than the Jeep's 8.75 inches. A limited slip differential and fully independent torsion bar suspension helped extract traction from its modest power. But the US War Department's own handbook on German military forces delivered a blunt verdict. The Volkswagen, the German equivalent of the American Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. In captured vehicle testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in November 1943, evaluators acknowledged the Kübelwagen was simpler to manufacture, but found it fundamentally less capable in actual field conditions. The production numbers told their own story. Germany built 50,435 Kübelwagens during the entire war. The United States shipped nearly that many Jeeps to the Soviet Union alone. Jeeps arrived in North Africa in early to mid-1942, and the vehicle's desert debut came to define its combat reputation. The transformation from utility vehicle to weapons platform happened through the ingenuity of soldiers who recognized what the Jeep could become. The British Special Air Service under Major David Stirling received its first batch of Jeeps in June 1942 in Egypt. SAS mechanics immediately recognized their potential as raiding platforms. They stripped windshields, mounted twin Vickers K machine guns loaded with tracer ammunition alongside 50-caliber Browning heavy machine guns, and loaded the vehicles with extra fuel, water, and rations for extended operations behind enemy lines. The defining raid came on the night of July 26th to 27th, 1942. 18 SAS Jeeps under Major Stirling attacked the German-held Sidi Hanish airfield, 235 miles west of Cairo. Navigating the desert in formation without headlights under a full moon, Stirling waited until runway lights switched on for a landing Luftwaffe bomber. Then he fired a green flare. The Jeeps stormed the airfield in V formation, raking parked Ju-87 Stukas, Ju-52 transports, and F-109 fighters with tracer fire. 37 Axis aircraft were destroyed at the cost of 2 SAS men killed and 1 Jeep lost. In 15 months before Stirling's capture in January 1943, the Special Air Service destroyed over 250 aircraft on the ground, along with supply dumps, railways, and hundreds of vehicles. Nearly all these operations were conducted from Jeeps. The desert warfare revealed both the vehicle's strengths and its limitations. Sand infiltrated everything. Filters clogged within hours of operation. Soldiers learned to carry spare parts that wore out fastest in desert conditions. But the Jeep's air cleaner and simple carburetor proved more tolerant of dust than more sophisticated engines. Its low weight allowed it to float over soft sand that would trap heavier vehicles. The wide gear spacing in low range let it crawl through dunes at speeds that maximized traction without digging in. Veterans of the North African campaign developed specific techniques for desert operation. They learned exactly how much speed to carry when cresting dunes. They discovered that deflating tires slightly improved flotation on soft surfaces. They found that the Jeep's short wheelbase, sometimes a liability on rough ground, actually helped it navigate the undulating terrain of the Erg, the great sand seas of the interior Sahara. When American forces landed in Operation Torch on November 8 through 16, 1942, Jeeps came ashore as standard equipment. Medical reports from the North African campaign noted that the Jeep proved readily adaptable for carrying litters over difficult terrain. Conventional ambulances were too slow and had poor traction in sand, while Jeeps excelled. This medical role would expand dramatically as the war progressed. The Jeep's European theatre service reached its peak intensity beginning June 6, 1944. Jeeps arrived on the Normandy beaches via two methods. Some were loaded into Horsa and Waco CG-4, gliders that accompanied airborne divisions. Others were driven off landing craft in follow-up waves across all 5 beaches. Glider missions, including Chicago, Detroit, Keokuk, and Elmira, delivered jeeps, artillery, and supplies to the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The heavy cargo proved hazardous, with jeeps sometimes shifting during landing and crashing through the wooden fuselage. On Utah Beach alone, approximately 1,700 vehicles came ashore by the end of D-Day, with jeeps among the earliest. Their light weight allowed them to drive directly off landing craft onto the sand. The breakout from Normandy demonstrated the jeep's value in fluid, fast-moving operations. As Allied forces pushed inland, jeeps served as the primary transport for reconnaissance units probing ahead of the main advance. They carried commanders forward to observe developing situations. They rushed ammunition to units in contact with the enemy. They evacuated wounded from aid stations to field hospitals. The Red Ball Express, the massive supply operation that kept Patton's Third Army fueled and armed during the race across France, relied heavily on jeeps for escort duty, traffic control, and communications. While the famous 2.5-ton trucks carried the bulk tonnage, jeeps served as the nervous system of the operation, conveying orders, reporting road conditions, and guiding convoys through unfamiliar territory. In the Normandy bocage, the ancient hedgerow country of northern France, retreating German forces strung piano wire across roads at neck height. The wire was designed to decapitate occupants of open vehicles traveling at speed. American soldiers responded with field-fabricated wire cutters, strips of angle iron bolted upright to the front bumper, extending 2 to 3 feet above the windshield with notched tops to catch and sever wires before they could reach the occupants. The 87th Chemical Battalion was documented installing these devices at the D-Day marshalling area in Chiffey, Torquay, Devon, before shipping to France. Similar modifications spread rapidly through frontline units, testimony to the Jeep's adaptability and the ingenuity of soldiers who depended on it for survival. The Battle of the Bulge produced the most extraordinary Jeep-related episode of the entire war. On Hitler's personal orders, issued October 22, 1944, SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny organized Operation Greif, a plan to use German commandos in captured American uniforms and vehicles to seize Meuse River bridges and sow chaos behind Allied lines. Skorzeny had requested 100 jeeps but received only about 30 captured vehicles. Approximately 150 English-speaking Germans, organized into teams of 3 to 4 men per jeep, infiltrated American lines beginning December 16, 1944. They cut telephone wires, swapped road signs, misdirected convoys, and spread disinformation. The operation was a military failure. Panzer Brigade 150's assault on Malmedy was repulsed on December 21st, but the psychological impact was extraordinary. Massive paranoia swept Allied rear areas. Sentries began quizzing unfamiliar soldiers about baseball scores, state capitals, and the names of Mickey Mouse's friends. One German team was caught when they requested petrol instead of gas, revealing their British-influenced English training. The security measures trapped even the highest-ranking officers. General Omar Bradley was briefly detained when he correctly answered Springfield as the capital of Illinois, but the military policeman incorrectly believed it was Chicago. General Bernard Montgomery had his Jeep's tires shot out by overzealous American sentries. Eisenhower was confined to his headquarters over Christmas, guarded by tanks, with a look-alike decoy deployed. 3 captured commandos, Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, Oberfeinrich Gunther Billing, and Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt, were executed by firing squad on December 23, 1944, at Henri Chapelle. In total, 16 of Skorzeni's commandos were executed for wearing enemy uniforms, a violation of the laws of war. The episode demonstrated how thoroughly the Jeep had become identified with American military power. The Germans believed that infiltrating American lines required Jeeps above all else. In the Pacific Theater, the Jeep's compact dimensions proved critical in jungle terrain, where larger vehicles simply could not operate. One vehicle earned a distinction unique in military history. A Willys MB, nicknamed Old Faithful, was the first Marine Jeep landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, at Lunga Beach. On October 13, during a Japanese battleship bombardment, it received 2 shrapnel holes in its windshield. The Marines awarded it the Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat, making it the first American vehicle ever to receive the decoration. Old Faithful served 4 Marine generals during the Guadalcanal campaign. It carried Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox and Admirals Chester Nimitz and William Halsey on inspection tours. It traveled over 11,000 miles of jungle terrain without requiring an engine overhaul. The Jeep was officially retired on December 22, 1943, and was later exhibited at the Plaza War Bond Center in San Diego before being sent to the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico, Virginia. Tragically, its current whereabouts are unknown. The Pacific Island campaigns presented challenges unknown in European operations. Coral surfaces shredded tires. Saltwater corroded metal components with alarming speed. Tropical humidity promoted fungal growth on leather and canvas. Japanese defenders targeted vehicles specifically, knowing that destroying American mobility degraded their logistics capability. Marines and soldiers developed specific adaptations for Pacific conditions. They waterproofed ignition systems before amphibious landings. They carried extra fan belts and water pump seals, components that failed quickly in the tropical heat. They learned to flush engines with fresh water after crossing tidal flats to remove corrosive salt deposits. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan were incorporated into training programs that prepared units for subsequent island assaults. The Marines developed the most notable Jeep ambulance conversion of the war through necessity and improvisation. Lieutenant Commander French Moore, a battalion surgeon with the 2nd Marine Division, designed a stretcher carrying modification that solved the critical problem of evacuating wounded from jungle terrain impassable to conventional ambulances. General Motors Holden in Melbourne, Australia, built an initial run of 200 units based on Moore's design. These Holden Jeep ambulances featured medical equipment lockers replacing the passenger seat and rear channels for sliding litters. They served at Bougainville, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. National Archives photographs from Iwo Jima show these ambulances with canvas ripped away, windshield glazing shattered, fenders battered, and shrapnel holes puncturing their hoods. They were still running, still carrying the wounded to safety. In the China-Burma-India theater, the Jeep confronted some of the war's most punishing terrain. Densely forested mountains receiving up to 175 inches of monsoon rainfall annually. The construction of the Stillwell Road, connecting Lido in Assam to Kunming in China, became one of the war's great engineering achievements. When General Joseph Stilwell asked General Louis Pick on November 3, 1943, whether he could build a road to Xingbuyang by January 1, Pick replied that he would build not a Jeep road but a military highway, and have it done by that day. The road reached Xingbuyang ahead of schedule, and construction continued through 1944. The full Stillwell Road, stretching 1,044 miles from Lido in Assam to Kunming in China, was completed in January 1945. The first convoy over the completed route included nearly 100 trucks, jeeps, ambulances, and light artillery pieces. The conditions along the Stillwell Road tested every aspect of the Jeep's design. Gradients exceeded anything encountered in North Africa or Europe. Hairpin turns carved into mountain faces left no room for error. Monsoon rains turned roads into rivers of mud. Leeches, mosquitoes, and tropical diseases afflicted drivers as severely as any mechanical breakdown. Maintenance crews performed miracles of improvisation to keep vehicles running. They fabricated replacement parts from scrap metal. They rebuilt transmissions under tarpaulins while rain poured around them. They developed techniques for freeing stuck vehicles from mud that swallowed them to the axles. The Go Devil engine's forgiving nature made field repairs possible. Its simple design meant that mechanics could diagnose and fix most problems with basic tools and local materials. Under Lend-Lease, approximately 50,000 to 52,000 Willys Jeeps were shipped to the Soviet Union. They traveled via 3 routes. Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were the most dangerous, subject to constant attack by German submarines and aircraft. The Persian corridor through Iran provided a safer but longer route. The Pacific route, which carried 50% of total Lend-Lease tonnage, moved supplies through Vladivostok. Most of the earlier Willys MA models went directly to Russia. The Red Army valued Jeeps for command and reconnaissance missions. Their speed, compact size, and low profile made them easy to camouflage and drive to forward positions under fire. Soviet officers particularly appreciated the vehicle's ability to navigate terrain that immobilized heavier equipment and its reliability in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Soviet forces even mounted 12 rail M8 82mm rocket launchers on Jeeps, creating mobile artillery platforms deployed in the Carpathian Mountains from December 1944. The Soviets also received over 3,000 Ford GPA amphibious Jeeps, which they valued for river crossings across Eastern Europe. War correspondent Henry Cassidy cabled from the Russian front that the American Jeep has met the Russian mud, and the situation is well in hand. The Jeep's official designation, truck, quarter-ton, 4x4, command reconnaissance, vastly understated its actual versatility. Beyond scouting and command duties, the vehicle was adapted into at least a dozen specialized roles, most through field modifications rather than factory variants. As a weapons platform, Jeeps commonly mounted 30 caliber M1919A 4 machine guns and 50 caliber M2 HB Brownings. The SAS pushed this furthest by fitting twin Vickers K guns and heavy Brownings simultaneously. As a communications vehicle, at least 14 signal corps radio sets were standardized for Jeep installation, including the SCR-284, SCR-508, and SCR-610. Perhaps most remarkably, Jeeps were fitted with flanged wheels to run on railroad tracks. These rail-converted Jeeps first appeared with the U.S. Army Air Forces in Australia in 1943, then expanded in the CBI Theatre, where the 1905 Engineer Aviation Battalion operated them in Burma in 1944. 11 days after D-Day, Jeep speeders were surveying rail lines from the Normandy beaches to Cherbourg. The Ford GPA amphibious Jeep, nicknamed the Seep, represented the most ambitious adaptation attempt. Designed by yacht designer Roderick Stevens Jr. of Sparkman and Stevens, who also designed the larger DUKW, it used the same Go Devil engine and drivetrain with an added hull, propeller, and rudder. 12,778 units were built between 1942 and March 1943, before production was halted. The Seep proved problematic. At 3520 pounds, it far exceeded its design specification of 2640 pounds. It sat too low in the water, swamped easily in anything beyond light chop, and handled clumsily on land. The U.S. Army considered it nearly useless for its intended beach landing role. By 1944, the Army issued bulletins explaining how axles could be salvaged from unwanted GP as to repair standard Jeeps. Ironically, the Soviets found the GPA valuable for inland river crossings, where calm water suited its limited freeboard. No vehicle of World War II received more eloquent tribute from those who depended on it for survival. The words of soldiers, correspondents, and commanders captured what specifications and production figures could not. Ernie Pyle, the Pulitzer Prize-winning war correspondent, wrote from Allied headquarters in North Africa on June 4, 1943. "Good Lord," he began, "I do not think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It is as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going. Pyle also called it a divine instrument of military locomotion. He was killed on April 18, 1945, on Shima Island near Okinawa. That morning, Pyle was traveling by jeep with Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Coolidge when a Japanese machine gun opened fire. All 5 occupants dove into a roadside ditch. When Pyle raised his head to check on Coolidge, a second burst caught him in the left temple, killing him instantly. General Dwight Eisenhower wrote in his memoir Crusade in Europe that 4 pieces of equipment came to be regarded by senior officers as among the most vital to success in Africa and Europe. They were the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 aeroplane. Curiously enough, he noted, none of these was designed for combat. Bill Mauldin, the cartoonist who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1945 at age 23 for his Willie and Joe cartoons in Stars and Stripes, was assigned his own jeep in early 1944. He named it Jeannie after his wife and drove it more than 10,000 miles through Italy and France, gathering material from the front lines. One of Mauldin's most celebrated cartoons depicts an old cavalry sergeant pressing his pistol against the hood of his disabled jeep, covering his eyes before delivering the mercy shot, treating the vehicle exactly as a cavalryman would treat a horse with a broken leg. The image captured the emotional bond between soldiers and the machines that carried them through war. Captured German officers expressed unexpected admiration for the jeep during post-war interrogations. Wehrmacht commanders who had faced American forces acknowledged that the little vehicle gave their enemy a mobility advantage they could not match. So many jeeps flooded the battlefield that some German soldiers reportedly believed every American soldier was issued his own personal vehicle. German forces actively sought captured jeeps, finding them superior to the Kübelwagen for most tactical purposes. The Japanese military also took notice. After capturing an American jeep in the Philippines in 1941 to 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army shipped it to Japan and ordered Toyota to reverse-engineer the design. The result was the Toyota AK-10 prototype, a vehicle with a 2.3-litre 4-cylinder engine, 3-speed manual transmission, and 2-speed transfer case. It saw only limited production during the war, but the experience planted a seed. In 1951, Toyota built the Jeep BJ for the Korean War, drawing directly on knowledge gained from studying the captured American vehicle. This became the direct ancestor of the Toyota Land Cruiser. Toyota initially called it the Jeep BJ, until Willys filed trademark complaints, forcing the name change to Land Cruiser in June 1954. The captured Jeep from the Philippines had spawned an automotive dynasty. The scale of Jeep production reflected American industrial capacity operating at wartime peak. Willys Overland's Toledo plant produced approximately 361,339 MB units between November 18, 1941 and September 21, 1945. Ford Motor Company, using multiple plants including River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan, plus facilities in Louisville, Chester, Dallas, Richmond, and Edgewater, produced approximately 277,896 GPW units from January 2, 1942 through mid-1945. Adding Bantam's 2605 BRC 40 units and the Ford GPA amphibious variant's 12,778 units, total wartime Jeep production reached approximately 647,925 vehicles. At peak output, the combined manufacturing rate reached roughly 1 Jeep every 90 seconds. American Central Manufacturing of Connersville, Indiana, fabricated approximately 3/4 of all Jeep bodies, with standardized composite bodies adopted by both Ford and Willys from January 1944 onward. Jeeps were shipped overseas, both fully assembled, driven directly onto transport ships, and crated or semi-knocked down for space efficiency. Ford's Richmond, California plant crated approximately 70% of its production for Pacific shipment. Jeeps also fit inside transport aircraft and large gliders, a critical capability for airborne operations. Nearly 30% of total production, roughly 182,000 units, went to Allied forces under Lend-Lease, equipping British, Soviet, Free French, and Chinese armies. The origin of the name Jeep has generated decades of speculation and myth. The most popular explanation that Jeep derives from GP for general purpose is largely incorrect. Ford's GP designation actually stood for government contract and 80-inch wheelbase, not general purpose. The Army officially designated the vehicle truck, quarter-ton, 4x4, never general purpose. A stronger connection runs to Eugene the Jeep, a character introduced by cartoonist E.C. Seeger in his Thimble Theatre and Popeye comic strip in March 1936. Eugene was a small, magical creature who could go anywhere and do anything, a description soldiers found perfectly apt for the little vehicle that climbed mountains, crossed deserts, and seemed capable of the impossible. The name crystallized publicly in February 1941 when Willys Overland staged a demonstration in Washington, driving the vehicle up the steps of the United States Capitol. Test driver Irving Hausman, known as Red, had heard soldiers at Camp Holabird calling the vehicle a Jeep. When reporter Catherine Hillier of the Washington Daily News asked what it was, Hausman answered simply, "It is a Jeep." Her nationally syndicated article, published around February 19th and 20th, included a photo captioned with the first documented use of the word Jeep in news media for this specific vehicle. Even before the war ended, Willys Overland was preparing for peace. The first CJ-2A, with CJ standing for Civilian Jeep, rolled off the Toledo production line on July 17, 1945, 1 month before VJ Day. Priced at $1090, it became the first mass-produced civilian four-wheel drive vehicle in history. Between 1945 and 1949, 214,760 CJ-2As were produced. The civilian version used the same Go Devil engine and basic chassis, but featured a 7-slot grille versus the MB's 9 slots, a tailgate, larger headlights, and a column-shift transmission. Willys marketed it as the Universal Jeep, targeting farmers and ranchers. The strategy proved inspired. Approximately 80% of American farmers at the time owned neither a truck nor a tractor. The Jeep filled both roles. The MB's design influence extended far beyond Willys. The Land Rover series, one of 1948, was directly inspired by wartime Jeeps that British engineer Maurice Wilks had encountered in military service. Mahindra in India, Mitsubishi in Japan, and manufacturers in Spain, Argentina, Brazil, and elsewhere built licensed or inspired versions. The Jeep Wrangler, introduced in 1987 and still in production, retains the basic silhouette and design philosophy of Karl Probst's 5-day sketch from 1940. The original military Jeep served continuously in American armed forces until the HMMWV replaced it in 1984, over 4 decades of frontline duty across Korea, Vietnam, and countless smaller conflicts. AM General, which designed the Humvee, was originally Jeep's own defense and government products division, spun off by AMC in 1971. The lineage from the Blitz buggy of 1940 to the armored vehicles of today runs unbroken. In 1991, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated the Willys MB an International Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark. Recognizing both its engineering achievement and its historical significance, the New York Museum of Modern Art displayed a military Jeep as one of the very few genuine expressions of machine art. What made the Jeep historically consequential was not any single specification, but the convergence of adequate capability across every dimension. It had enough power, enough traction, enough range, and enough payload, all in a package small enough to go anywhere, simple enough to repair in the field, and inexpensive enough to manufacture in staggering quantities. Karl Probst's weekend sketch, Barney Roos's torque-rich engine, and American industrial capacity combined to produce not merely a vehicle, but a force multiplier that redefined military mobility. The Go Devil engine's 105 pound-feet of torque at 2,000 RPM, nearly 3 times the output of its German counterpart, meant the Jeep could tow artillery, carry wounded soldiers, mount heavy weapons, and climb grades that stopped other vehicles. All this on roughly 20 miles per gallon. Germany built 50,000 Kübelwagens in the entire war. America built more than that in Jeeps for the Soviet Union alone. By the time the last wartime Jeep rolled off the production line in September 1945, nearly 650,000 had been manufactured. They had served on every continent, in every climate, in roles their designers never imagined. They had carried generals and privates, ammunition and wounded, radios and rocket launchers. The Jeep did not win the war by itself. No single weapon or vehicle ever does. But it carried the soldiers who did win the war, across deserts and beaches, through jungles and mountains, over rivers and snow. It went places tanks could not go, moved faster than infantry could march, and proved tough enough to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser machines. Ernie Pyle, writing from North Africa in 1943, captured its essence in words that have echoed through 8 decades since. It does everything. It goes everywhere. In those 6 simple words, the legendary correspondent summarized not just a vehicle but an entire philosophy of design, a triumph of practical engineering over theoretical perfection, of American industrial democracy over Axis precision manufacturing. The men who drove jeeps through North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific Islands, Burma, and into Germany and Japan have mostly passed from living memory. But the vehicle they depended upon remains, not just as a museum piece or a collector's prize, but as an active design lineage still rolling off production lines today. Every modern Jeep, every Land Rover, every Land Cruiser, every military utility vehicle that followed carries the genetic imprint of what a handful of engineers accomplished in Butler, Pennsylvania and Toledo, Ohio, between July and November of 1940. They had been given an impossible task, an absurd deadline, and specifications that defied engineering logic. They succeeded anyway. And in doing so, they created something that transcended its original purpose to become, in ways both practical and symbolic, one of the defining machines of the 20th century.